The CTMU provides a complete and advanced interpretation of quantum mechanics, coupling its formalisms with that of reality as a whole. A brief tour through the history and problems of quantum mechanics should suffice to see why the CTMU meta-interpretive mapping of quantum mechanics, which is not preemptively closed to teleology and advanced causation, not only explains the findings of 20th century quantum mechanical physics, but also the structures and dynamics of reality as a whole. In the mid 1920s, it became apparent to the scientists on the cutting edge of the physical sciences, such as Werner Heisenberg, Louis de Broglie, and Erwin Schrödinger of cat fame, that the Bohr model of an atom, which consisted of electrons which filled out discrete energy levels and revolve in circular orbits around the nuclear atom, the nucleus of an atom, was insufficient. What they found through such experiments as the double slit experiment is that subatomic quanta, such as electrons, behave both as waves and as particles. When passed through a double slit, rather than displaying a definite position and velocity, photons or electrons produce an interference pattern on a screen, which represents a superposition of many possible states from which the quantum wave function probabilistically selects. German theoretical physicist Max Planck discovered that energy could only be gained or lost in whole number multiples of the quantity hv, where h is Planck's constant, determined by experiment to be around 6 times 10 to the negative 34, multiplied by the wavelength of electromagnetic radiation, v. Basically, energy is quantized and can only occur in discrete packets called quanta. To call the motion of these quanta motion is an assumption, as we have never observed the motion of a particle from one position to the next, or the collapse of the theoretical probabilistic wave function from which the quanta selects into a quantum particle. Further, since these particles are sensitive to human observation, and their collapse only occurs once registered in experiment, we must go to a deeper level of theorization than ordinary empirical science to understand the true nature of quantum mechanics. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle says that delta x times delta mv is greater than or equal to h pi over 4, meaning that the uncertainty in a particle's position times the uncertainty of a particle, h over pi 4, that times the uncertainty of a particle's momentum, mass times velocity, is greater than Planck's constant, the smallest discrete unit of reality for empirical science, divided by 4. For very small lengths, this is a huge problem. There's tons of uncertainty. We cannot know the position and velocity of a quantum particle at the same time. The more we know about a particle's momentum, the less accurately we know its position, and vice versa. These are not values determined by past states. Like in classical mechanics, you just take the derivative of its position, and there you have it. You have its velocity, and you can take the derivative of that, and you can find its acceleration. But in quantum mechanics, they only have a probabilistic connection to one another. We can only predict the relative probability of a particular state, just like how a bell curve predicts that 68% of people will have IQs between 85 and 115, but that doesn't tell you anything about an individual or about an individual particle. In fact, quantum mechanics can tell us nothing about the position or momentum of a particular particle at the same time. So it seems, according to Heisenberg, Bohr, etc., this is the Copenhagen consensus that they kind of came to, is that there must be something generative within the structure of the particle itself, which somehow selects for its own properties. And further, owing to Niels Bohr's correspondence principle, the syntax which determines the structure and dynamics of quantum systems must scale and correspond to the equations of classical physics, and as well, in principle, the biological and cosmic evolution of reality and nature as a whole. And so this agrees in part or in whole with the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which was the product of a consensus of many of the early physicists researching this field, including Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and others. And this asserts that there is some deeper structure which probabilistically selects the position and momentum of the quantum particle from a superposition of many possible states, and thus that these quantum systems lack definite properties prior to being measured. According to Erwin Schrödinger, the electron could be treated as a standing wave, and the evolution of the quantum system through the non-relativistic differential equation h hat psi equals e psi, where an operator, h hat, on the wave function psi determine the distribution of the total energy E of the atom. So it's basically arranging the substance of these discrete packets of energy, these quanta, and thus the position and velocity of the quantum particle. There's this wave function which probabilistically selects one state out of a space of possibility. And so the quantum mechanics, and this proved to be a little unsatisfactory because it doesn't explain how this happens, why there is this wave particle duality in the first place. And so the quantum mechanics interpretation industry, as Chris Langen, the author of the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, calls it, is driven by the lack of a conceptual framework for the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's all the different interpretations are reacting against that original position. And so, because it can accommodate things such as generativity, or even the support for such things as probability waves and the equations that govern them in empirical or even strictly physical reality. These phenomena simply can't be observed through the methods of empirical science. They're not physical, they're metaphysical. They require a deeper reality theoretic structure to accommodate them. The same rules which support and constrain human cognition and perception also support and constrain the mathematical formalisms of the quantum wave function collapse and the mathematical structure of quantum mechanics and the universe in general, which are called the global qualio-perceptual syntax and logico-mathematical syntax of the universe, respectively. And so this brings to bear, if we have a reality which actually has this deeper mathematical and perceptual structure, the possibility, at least, of bringing into consistent mutual contact the quantum wave function collapse with the perception of human observers, which is what we're trying to do in the first place, because we've observed that these quantum particles are sensitive to human observation, but have no model to accommodate perception's impact on reality. And this is what the CTMU brings to bear. And so that explains why quantum particles seem to be, or perhaps are, sensitive to human observation. So in the CTMU, reality is described as a metaformal system called M for short, an intrinsic meta-language which both describes and reality, which both creates and describes reality, renews that, and fortifies its identity through a self-dual signature consisting of a non-terminal and terminal domain. The non-terminal domain is this world of design and potential, so that kind of corresponds to the wave part of the quantum wave function. Is that when it's in this wave, it's a superposition of these many possible states, and so you have this potentialization, and then there's the actualization, which is the terminal domain, and this is what we can see. This is stuff which has been actualized. And the terminal domain consists of syntactors or syntactic operators, which, like the Hamiltonian operators of the Schrödinger equation, determine the syntactic self-distribution of reality on the global, agentive, and subordinate levels. The non-terminal domain consists of structurally complex syntactors called tellers, who shape reality through cognition and global or agentive telesis, a generalization of mind and will which supports the generativity of ultimate reality. And so examples of agentive tellers include human beings, or e.g. scientists, and the primary or global teller is the global operator descriptor, whose name reflects both its implicit coupling with the Hamiltonian operators applied to the global scale, determining not the energy wave function, but the telic self-distribution, the intrinsic end, purpose, and design of reality, and therefore its correspondence to the logically valid strains of monotheism. This is what we're talking about, is God supporting and constraining both theistic personalism, the idea of a personal creator, and classical theism, the idea of God as the ground and source of all being. And so where subatomic particles in the physical domain, T, this terminal domain, which consists of physical objects and relations, are identified with the subordinate syntax of tertiary syntactors, they thus rely on the secondary level, which is these observer participants in reality, such as human beings, and the primary level, which is the God, which is the creator of all of existence. It relies on all of these higher levels of causation, called metacausation in the CTMU, to account for their genesis, self-organization, and emergence. So really, these particles aren't doing very much. They're just able to, there's this telic self-distribution, there's this syntax which exists everywhere in reality, and they're simply reacting to that. And that's what we're observing with these quantum mechanical experiments. And so the non-terminal domain can be geometrically identified with a Cons-spensive manifold, which is like the manifold of classical mechanics. You have objects moving through space, but it's actually the dual of that, because it's what's actually designing and actualizing and potentializing all of these various things. And so it's a metamathematical structure, Langen calls it, which it's a metamathematical structure which evolves with reality. It reflects the evolving structure of reality over time, and all of that is embedded within this manifold. And so it's generative in a real sense, because its instances are being generated at the same time as it is. There's not this like predetermined path for reality. It's actually generative. There is this kind of primordial freedom which pervades everything. And so it uses N, the Cons-spensive manifold uses N, uses the non-terminal domain, uses this programming domain as to program the T, to program this display domain to self-replicate and self-select according to the evolution, evolving structure, and teleology of reality itself. And so the Cons-spensive manifold generates a set of non-terminal strings and projects them onto physical timeline. And thus the causal deficits of the present quantum mechanical model is because we're only looking at the terminal domain. We're not thinking about what do the findings of what we're observing, which is that there is this quantum wave function, there is this collapse, that there is this higher something selecting from that, and we're assuming that everything in there is physical. Werner Heisenberg actually says this explicitly. He has this idea of the potentiae, which is kind of in between in a potentialization and actualization. But he calls this a physical object, which is absurd, because how could that exist physically if it hasn't been actualized? And so we're kind of absurdly insisting that all of this structure has to exist in the terminal domain, whereas the real dynamics and structure of quantum mechanics and the real dynamics and structure of reality, in fact, exist in the non-terminal domain. And so this can be explained by the supporting structure of higher levels of this self-similar reality system. Because quantum particles are tertiary images of the GOD, which reflect the overall coherence of reality, they can function as physical content for the underlying structure and dynamics of the Cons-spensive manifold, and be sensitive to the fulfillment of the teleology of their telonic counterparts in the non-terminal domain. So there's this telon, which is actually what's doing the thing, and then we're just observing the effect of that. And so that's how you can think about this, is we're only observing the effect of this deeper structure. And that's true not only for scientific observation, but for everything that we observe. Reality, as distinguished from non-reality or pure self-relation, is quantized according to its intrinsic drive for self-identification, using its secondary tellers, including human beings and other advanced life forms, as telonic resources to fortify and renew its identity. So we're secondary images of the GOD, and we're participating in the self-exploration or self-identification of reality itself. In his 2019 paper, Introduction to Quantum Metamechanics, Chris Langen writes, just as the GOD is the primary metaformal quantum of reality, and elementary particles are tertiary quanta, human beings are secondary quanta with a combination of coherence and complexity that allows them to meaningfully and freely self-model, configuring reality by configuring themselves. In other words, in the metaformal system, life and consciousness are specifically quantized as innately coherent secondary tellers whose coherent existence surpasses their physical emergence. The Cons-spensive manifold, by generating and coupling with its content, is truly generative and reflective of the evolving structure of reality. I cannot iterate this enough, that we can't have these sort of formalisms and this quantum field theory and classical mechanics, and the problem is we'll never get these to align because they're all separated from the real universe. And so this is what Chris Langen says, that the Cons-spensive manifold is designed as a joint medium for quantum mechanics and general relativity. And that's, of course, beyond the scope of this video. I've made videos about this. But it's important to note is that we need to actually rethink the way we're thinking about physics and about models and about theories, and have a way that there is this syntactic correspondence between what we're actually observing and the ideas we have in our head, or else no science would ever work. And so the current quantum mechanics interpretation industry in that sense is actually anti-scientific, because it's not actually taking into consideration the entailments of its work, besides for a select few. So it can accommodate the structure through which the collapse of quantum particles occurs, this Cons-spensive manifold, according to the global teleology of reality, even as they are generated on the fly, these tertiary syntactors, according to freely changing internal conditions through perception by secondary tellers. The CTMU can thus fulfill the requirement of Bohr's correspondence principle, that the formalisms of quantum mechanics and subatomic quanta should scale and correspond to the equations of classical physics and the dynamics and structure of reality as a whole. Chris Langen writes that, quote, QM is thus mapped to the open top layer of the Cons-spensive manifold, where inner expansion is approximated by the symmetric, time-like propagation of the wave function according to the time-dependent Schrödinger equation, bearing in mind that psi x in the Schrödinger equation must ultimately be formulated in terms of the point structure and topological dynamic of the manifold. And so all of these things still hold true. The Schrödinger equation and the time-bound process by which the quantum wave function collapses, but we're mapping that process into the Cons-spensive manifold itself. And so Langen continues, Cons-spensive collapse is thus analogous to wave function reduction, collapse/projection. So this wave function reduction is actually, the Cons-spensive manifold is an extension of that to all of reality. And so that's, you can kind of think about the self-potentialization of reality as this cosmic wave function, not in the sense of someone like Hugh Everett, who would say that there is this cosmic wave function and reality splits into a different timeline at every little point in its evolution, and there's this multiverse. But no, that there's actually this metaverse, as Langen calls it. That was actually a term coined by Chris Langen before it was used, for example, by Mark Zuckerberg to rebrand Facebook, is that there's this metaverse from which is constantly potentializing, and that is what reality is this cosmic wave function that actually selects one particular universe. And that's what we're doing all the time through our mind and will, distributed over all of time, going, in some sense, if you kind of think critically about the nature of time, all the way back to the distant past and into the distant future, is all affecting this meta simultaneously. And so the CTMU synthesizes the best of the various interpretations of quantum mechanics and maps them into the supporting and constraining infrastructure of CTMU metalogic. Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg's Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, herein discussed, must be modified to account for the generative nature of the quantum wave function collapse as the expression of the structure and dynamics of a deeper supporting reality. To the extent that the Copenhagen interpretation explicitly denies the existence of any deeper reality than the formalisms of quantum mechanics itself, it is thus inconsistent with the CTMU. Because the Copenhagen interpretation asserts the indeterminacy/randomness of reality itself at the quantum level, which is absurd, it cannot fulfill Bohr's own criterion for its correspondence to the deterministic formalisms of classical mechanics, or to ultimate reality, which is, as we know, the purposeful expression of deeper structure and dynamics, which are self-similar at all scales, including the quantum level. The CTMU, on the other hand, provides much-needed logical support to maverick physicist John Wheeler's notion of observer-created reality, or a participatory universe. And the CTMU can actually be thought of as a model of this idea, in which the observation of observer participants, called secondary tellers in the CTMU, give tangible existence to the early history of the universe through the retrocausal decoherence of the quantum wave function, which in turn creates a reality habitable by observer participants. So it's a closed loop. Basically, physics gives rise to observer participancy gives rise to information, and then information gives rise to physics. And so it's a self-synthesizing information system which begins and ends with observer participants. And that's the kind of thing which the CTMU actually affords logical support for. Essentially, reality is structured in such a way that it must give rise to life forms capable of participating in and informing the evolving structure of the universe. This is completely consistent with the CTMU, with Chris Langan noting that, quote, reality can indeed be generated by telluric observers, that this reality is actually responding to the freely changing internal condition of its secondary tellers, and thus parameterizing and defining its existence and evolution on the fly. And so the CTMU is not only a valid source of insight regarding the correspondence between the ideas of quantum mechanics and reality itself, but also shows that the underlying principles of physics not only do not contradict, but in fact reveal the basic religious worldview, which, in the words of Israeli author Yossi Klein Halevi, can be summarized that, quote, the unseen is ultimately more real than the material, that this world is not a random construct, but an expression, however veiled, of a purposeful creation, that we are not primarily bodies, but souls, rooted in oneness. Or in CTMU language, the non-terminal domain is more real than the terminal domain. The structure and dynamics of reality and its evolution cannot be attributed to randomness or determinacy, but rather an intrinsic, telic, advanced causation by the God, by God Almighty. We are not primarily syntactors, but tellers, related in profound and intrinsic ways to all other secondary images of God as expressions of the same ultimate identity. It thus provides the basis for the long-sought connection between science and religion, a bridge between faith and reason. Let the light shine forth in the darkness. May the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. Like and subscribe. Peace.